Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for the kind words. So my talk will be on behavioral and complexity macroeconomics. So the overall topic of this session here is macroeconomic theory. What have we learned? And I would like to show you what I have learned when I worked on behavioral macroeconomics. So the focus of my talk will be first on behavioral macroeconomics. This is not directly post-Keynesian economics, but I hope that you can see connections. So this is, at least in some respects, quite compatible with post-Keynesian macroeconomics. So behavioral macroeconomics, what is this? Well, this is the influence or the application of the insights of behavioral economics on macro by considering, well, the human limitations and complications, right? So this is a nice quote by Muthalathan and Thaler, so I really like this. So people have realized that Homo economicus is probably a bad model of man and there should be something more realistic, right? So we study the real behavior of people. And this became of interest to macroeconomists, well, so from the late 1990s, early 2000s onwards. So there was a lot of research in the early and mid-2000s, and especially now after the financial crisis. And it's also related to behavioral finance. So you may know the word or the expression of irrational exuberance, which was mentioned by Alan Greenspan in 1999 when he was looking at the Nasdaq and the evolution of the stock market, which led up to the dot-com bubble. And then later it was picked up by Robert Shiller in his famous book, also called Irrational Exuberance. So some people realized at that time that apparently in financial markets not everything is rational, and we have to look at the real behavior of people in order to understand what's going on there. So, and this is of course quite related to macro, which is very apparent, very clear after the financial crisis. So what I'm going to do in the next, say, 20 to 30 minutes is to give you a very quick overview over behavioral macroeconomics as I see it. So a very quick tour through the literature, what is there, and then I'm going to discuss a host of problems that I see with behavioral macroeconomics. And in particular, I'm going to talk about the representative agent framework. This may not be new, but I think it's really worth emphasizing that this is also very relevant if you talk about behavioral macroeconomics. What I really want to stress here in my talk is that it's important to distinguish between the different levels. So the micro level of individuals, households, firms, and the macro level or the aggregate level. And of course, as you all know, when we use representative agents, normally we don't have that distinction, right? So basically, there is no macro anymore. Then basically it's all micro, and macro is gone through the window. And of course, if we really want to talk about macroeconomics, then we have to make this distinction. And this is of course very difficult with a representative agent framework. And because of the problems that I have with pure, say, behavioral macroeconomics, I think that it should be extended. And that explains the title of my talk. I think we should not talk about only talk about behavioral macroeconomics, but we should talk about behavioral and complexity macroeconomics. So I think this should be a unit, and I'm going to explain why I think that this is necessary, and I hope that I can convince you that the complexity aspect is also very, very important. Okay, so before we start, well, let me briefly say that I think, well, and you all know that this is true, that there are two ways of macroeconomic theorizing, right? So the first is that we focus only on the aggregate level. Right? This is done in old-style Keynesian macro. This is also done very often in post-Keynesian macro. And you could say this is system dynamics analysis. So we just look at aggregate entities and aggregate relationships between those variables and study the evolution or the dynamic behavior of such a macroeconomic system. Right? And what do we use? What kind of relationships between variables do we use? Well, for example, we could use accounting identities from the national accounting system. We could use technological constraints, resource constraints, and others. Right? So this is what is typically done in that branch of the literature. And very recently, kind of a new version of this is, well, what is called stock flow consistent models, which often also remains at the aggregate level. And then there is a second way of thinking about the macroeconomy, macroeconomic systems, and this is by using models which have microfoundations. And this, as you all know, of course, is what people in the new Keynesian or neoclassical camp do. So the DSGE models, the infamous DSGE models, of course, are very proud of their microfoundations, because this unifies microeconomics and macroeconomics, and this is seen as something which is a very good idea. And I would agree that in principle this might be a good idea, so combining microeconomics and macroeconomics and deriving macroeconomic relationships, say bottom up from the behavior of individuals, is a good idea for some purposes, right? So it may give you interesting insights. This may be very important if you talk about policy, for example, if you really want to understand where certain phenomena at the macro level come from. I think this is a good idea. But I also think that it's not always needed, right? So I'm not at all against this kind of aggregate analysis. I think it depends on the purpose. It depends on what you want to do, right? I think there are good reasons to leave out microfoundations, but there may be also good reasons to include them, right? So I would not be dogmatic here. And of course, I would not subscribe to the view of the neoclassicals or the new Keynesians that models with microfoundations are always superior to models which are purely aggregate models. Not at all, right? So I would not agree here. But let me make a strong statement. What I really believe is that models with perfectly rational representative agents are a very bad idea, right? And if you want to have microfoundations, you shouldn't do it that way, right? Because I already mentioned this, representative agents trivialize the aggregation process. In a sense, there is no aggregation anymore, and through the aggregation process, many things can happen, right? And this is why it's so important to distinguish between the micro and the macro level, and if you use representative agents, well, then you don't do that. So this is a trivialization, and basically, it's killing macroeconomics. So we should not do that. So one of the main messages that I want to get across here is that if you use macroeconomic models with microfoundations, then you should do it in the right way, and not in this way. Okay? Okay, so let me give you a very, very quick history, very brief history of behavioral economics. So macroeconomics is both a very recent and new topic, but also an old one. So if you go to John Maynard Keynes, then you see that he had already many behavioral insights. Right? So he had insights about consumption, how households or individuals consume. He had this idea of animal spirits, and of course, how people behave under fundamental uncertainty. All this goes back to Keynes. So many ideas that are discussed today, of course, go back to Keynes. But Keynes was an armchair theorist. So he was not really a psychologist, and he did not really do empirical research on the psychological foundations of behavior, but he had good intuitions, right? So in a sense, many of the ideas that come back today go back to Keynes. Somebody else who is not so well known, but still very important, and I think that many more people should know him, is George Katona. So originally he was a psychologist, but then he turned to economics, and especially to macroeconomics, and tried to combine macroeconomics with psychology. And he did that already in the 1940s, during the war years, and in the 1950s and 60s. So he wrote a couple of books and really tried to do something which we might call behavioral macroeconomics. So he called it psychological economics, but we could call it behavioral macroeconomics. And he is known for, or should be known for, being the father of consumer sentiment. So he was at the University of Michigan and set up that center that collected all that data on consumer expectations and consumer sentiment, right? And of course, nowadays we have collections, or we have surveys on consumer sentiment and consumer mood in every country. And all this goes back to George Katona and his research group, right? So this is quite important, of course, in applied work, in empirical work, but he gets fairly little credit for this. Right? So there was a lot of research in his group and at the University of Michigan throughout all that time from the 1940s until the 1970s, but this is not so well known, so many people don't know that. So what happened is that macroeconomics started with many behavioral ideas and insights, but a lot of this was forgotten, right? And when the Keynesians came, so in the 1950s, Hicks and others, they eliminated many of those behavioral features in macro. So in a sense, behavioral macroeconomics lay dormant for many years, right, for about 50 years or so. So there was this work by Katona and others, but this was really only a niche. And then it was, in a sense, rediscovered in the early 2000s. So there was the lecture, the Nobel lecture by George Akerlof, with the title Behavioral Macroeconomics and Macroeconomic Behavior. Right? So and this basically spurred a new interest in behavioral macroeconomics. So in this talk, which is also published, of course, in the American Economic Review, he talks about the six unexplained phenomena in neoclassical macroeconomics. And says, well, what we really have to do in order to explain those phenomena is to turn to psychology and to turn to real behavior. So, and he says, well, some people already did that, and we have something like a rediscovery of psychology in macroeconomics. So this was at in the early 2000s, and in 2007 there was a conference organized by the Boston Fed, with the title Implications of Behavioral Economics for Economic Policy, where people also talked a lot about macroeconomic issues, inflation, for example, and implications of behavioral macro for monetary policy. And this is interesting because within a relatively short time, it made its way already into the policy domain, right? So policy makers saw, or at least some, not all, but some saw that there might be something interesting and that there might be something that we need in order to do better monetary and potentially other policies. And this was even before the financial crisis. So what is the current state of the literature? So I'm going to be very brief here. I really want to sketch only what approaches we have in the literature today. So I would say that there are, in principle, 4 different approaches, which we might call the ad hoc behavioral approaches or approach, some partial behavioral models, experiments, laboratory experiments, and also some attempts to marry new Keynesian models or standard DSGE models with behavioral approaches or behavioral insights. So the first one, so this ad hoc approach, is already quite old. It goes back already to the 1990s. And we have some features like, say, habit formation or rule of some consumers in those standard new Keynesian macroeconomic models. And some mainstream people might say, well, what do you want? We have this, right? So this is already there, and this was there for, or has been there for quite a long time. So we have incorporated behavioral features into our models. Well, yes, this is in a sense true, but this is not really behavioral. Why? Well, because these people are not really interested in the behavioral or psychological foundations of behavior. They do not really ask where habit formation comes from or why some people might be rule of some consumers or the like. So basically what these people do is to introduce these features in a fairly ad hoc manner in order to get a better fit to the data. Right? That's what they do. They say, okay, we observe that there is not enough persistence in the time series of consumption that our models produce. So what we do is to include habit formation, and then we smooth the time series that we produce in our models. Why we have habit formation? Well, this is not really discussed. It's just introduced in order to get the data, to get a better data fit. The same might be true when people include rule of some consumers. For example, in order to get a certain a better fit of the Phillips curve or things like that, right? So yes, okay, you can say there are some behavioral features, but these people are not really interested in that. It's basically just instrumental. Very different is the literature, or the examples that I've mentioned here. So there is some literature that goes back to Kahneman and co-authors in the 1980s, which discusses the importance of fairness and fairness perceptions on price setting and wage setting. So for example, whether it's possible or not for a company to change prices. So this may not be possible if this is perceived as unfair under certain circumstances. And this, of course, may explain rigidities, price rigidities and wage rigidities, right? And Kahneman and co-authors, they did a lot of interviews and also some hypothetical experiments and tried to learn what the principles are. So what is perceived as unfair or as fair by consumers, by customers, right? So this is quite interesting. There is also some research on, say, consumption, by Sheffrin and Saylor, for example. This is the behavioral life cycle model of consumption as an alternative to the standard discounted utility model. There is, of course, the idea of hyperbolic discounting or non-standard, non-exponential discounting put forward by Leibson and others, for example, so that people observe that intertemporal choices are often inconsistent, right, and are not compatible with exponential discounting. So there is a lot of work in that domain. And there is some other work. But while this is very relevant for macroeconomics, this is not truly macroeconomics, because these are behavioral, or these are partial models. They just focus on one aspect, say, for example, discounting or price and wage setting, but don't embed these approaches into a wider framework, into a macroeconomic model. So this is relevant, this is important, but it's strictly speaking not macro. This is in a sense behavioral economics on the background of some macroeconomic questions or issues. Related to that work is the recent experimental work, and I have done some research myself in that field. So there are experiments, for example, on the formation of expectations. There is some experimental work on the significance of sunspots, for example. There are many models or experiments on consumption, intertemporal consumption choice, consumption and savings. And what most people do here is to implement a standard, say, new Keynesian model with micro foundations in the laboratory, and then to test whether the predictions of such a model are observed in the lab or not, in the experiment. So in a sense, very often, this is a test, or these are tests of the standard models. Well, what do you find in this literature? It depends how you want to see that. Very often you find, well, these models fit somehow, but not perfectly. So it depends whether what your a priori expectation is. Whether these models are good or bad depends, right? You could say, well, the glass is half full or half empty. Right? They never fit perfectly, but they never fail miserably. So there is something to it, but it's not perfect. And most models or most experiments are really closely tied to theoretical models And you can criticize this, and I'm very unhappy with this myself, because this is very closed. So it's very hard to generate new insights in this way. You always refer to some existing models, and then you always have this leeway of how you interpret whether the fit is good or bad, right? So I myself and some co-authors, we also did some kind of exploratory research, but this is not so accepted in that literature. So to leave it more open in order to see what you get. Well, some work on expectation formation by Kars Holmes and his group is also a bit more open in order to discover potential rules that people might apply or use in order to form expectations. Okay, and finally, there are some people like Paul de Grauwe or, for example, Dantin and Koman who want to marry or combine standard approaches, standard DSGE models with behavioral insights, right? So to combine things from here or from the experiments with a standard macroeconomic neoclassical or new classical framework. So for example, de Grauwe incorporates fundamentalist and extrapolative forecasting into a DSGE model. Dantin and Koman, for example, have a gift exchange model in the labor market in an otherwise standard neoclassical or new Keynesian model. You can do that, but I'm not really convinced that this is the way to go, right? So, okay, so what are the problems? I already indicated or alluded to some of the problems, so let me discuss some of those problems a little bit more in detail. So many of those papers, I've said that already, these papers here, these papers, and all those in that tradition, just focus on some issues, which is fine, this is okay, you can do that, but they do not describe a macroeconomic system. So you can always question, is this macro or not? So I myself got this question fairly often. When I presented experimental work, which I labeled experimental macro, some people said, well, why is this macro? And I always said, well, this relates to a macro question. But then people said, well, but where are the macroeconomic consequences? Where is the system? And some people try to implement macroeconomic systems in the laboratory and to do really systems experiments. So Reinhard Selten, for example, did this. But this is very, very complicated, and it's questionable what you learn from this. But this is done. But most papers don't do that and really just focus on relatively narrow issues. Okay. This approach that I've mentioned here introduces behavioral features into otherwise mainstream models. So what you get in those models sometimes or very often is that some agents optimize and others use heuristics. Or some agents form rational expectations and others do not. So it could be that, for example, that firms form rational expectations and have a lot of information, but the central bank does not, or has an informational disadvantage, which is a bit odd, right? But there are those models. So some people do that. They pick out, or they pick one aspect in such a model, replace it by some behavioral assumption, but leave it otherwise as it is. And I think this is not really a good idea. These models are not internally consistent, right? So why do you choose some behavioral feature in one part of the model, but not in others? Right? So this is not consistent. I think we should not do this. I think this is not really convincing and leads to all kind of odd effects. Another problem is, well, there is something that some people call the wilderness of bounded rationality. So you can say there is just one way of being perfectly rational, but there are, of course, 1,000 ways of being boundedly rational or irrational or not rational or in the substantive sense. And then it's hardly convincing just to pick one or to choose one particular behavior for the representative agent. So if you work with a representative agent model, of course you can assume that the representative agent is loss averse, or that the representative agent is myopic, has fairness concerns, or whatever. Of course you can do that, but why this and not something else? right? So, and there might be competing behavioral models, and whenever you endow the representative agent with some behavior, you always have to answer the question, why this one and why not another one? There is a host of results in the behavioral literature, and it's always a bit arbitrary what you choose, right? You can choose this one, you can choose another one, but it's just one when you have a representative agent. And this is hardly convincing, at least for me. So what we observe, of course, in empirical work is that we have different degrees of rationality, or we have different types of agents with different behaviors. So, for example, we know from empirical work that people have different degrees of forward orientation, or that people have different propensities to plan. Some people make very long-run plans, and others do not plan at all. And some others plan a little bit for the next 2 or 3 years, or make some rough plans. So we know that, right? So there are different people, and of course not everybody is concerned with fairness, or people may have different conceptions of what is fair, right? There are different theories or different fairness ideals, right? So why just one? There are many. So people are heterogeneous, so we have different agents. But of course this is very hard to incorporate into mathematical models. So if you can work maybe with 2 types, or if you describe the heterogeneity just by one parameter that you can vary along some interval, well, then it may be possible. But if you have different types with very different behavior, then you very, very quickly get to some limits and cannot proceed, right? And that's why people don't do that, of course. So it's very, very difficult. And finally, one problem is that behavior may change, and it may depend on external circumstances. So behavior may not always be exactly the same, right? So sometimes people may care about fairness, and others, the same people, may not. And this may depend on external circumstances. And again, this is difficult to do in standard equilibrium models. So having worked myself on these things for quite some while, now I'm pretty convinced that it's not a good idea to incorporate these things into standard mainstream models. This does not work, or we should not do that. There are people who do that, but I think this is a dead end. So we need a different approach. So what do we need? I think we need 2 things. We need first a new theoretical framework. So we need some idea what we are doing here, right? So what is the theoretical background on which we build our models? And secondly, we need new modeling tools, right? And I believe that both are available, and I would suggest that we could turn to complexity economics for the theoretical framework, and we can turn to agent-based modeling as a tool if we want to incorporate behavioral insights into macroeconomics. So I would argue, I believe that complexity economics is the, or maybe an, adequate framework for macroeconomics. So what do I mean by behavior, or by complexity economics? Well, this is the strand of the literature that sees the economy as a complex adaptive system. And what is a complex adaptive system? Well, a very famous definition is that it's a system which is composed of a large number of agents that interact, so this is of course important, and adapt or learn. So they may change their behavior potentially as a response to the interaction with others and with the interaction with the environment, right, with the non-agent environment. And what is very important here is that we have decentralized decision making. So very often people say these agents are autonomous. What does it mean? Well, they are able to make decisions under any circumstances. Whether this is in equilibrium or not does not play a role, right? So this is non-equilibrium economics. We may have an equilibrium, there may be something like a steady state, but this is not imposed, but it would be a result of the model, right? And this is very, very important. So, and complex adaptive systems will have some interesting features. They feature self-organization and emergence. What does it mean? Well, we may have regularities at the macroeconomic level, which are the result of interactions of individual decisions. And one such pattern might be some kind of equilibrium, right? So we may end up in a situation which is in some sense stable, for example, but maybe we do not, right? So it depends. But what is really an important lesson from that literature is that macro patterns are typically very different from micro patterns. So if you are in that paradigm or in that school, of course you are well aware of fallacies of composition, right? Which is something which is very important in post-Keynesian economics. So what we also have in complex adaptive systems, if we go to the system level, then we typically observe that we have nonlinear dynamics. So these models, if you would like to describe those models by dynamic models, dynamic equations, then you would need nonlinear equations, nonlinear models, right? So because of the interaction, you get feedback effects, positive feedback effects, negative feedback effects, and all kinds of nonlinearities. And what is also very important, and this is related to that idea of emergence, is that we have uncertainty. So, and this has two twists. So one twist is that the agents in those models are exposed to uncertainty because they don't know what will happen and they don't know what other agents will do. So this is a kind of behavioral uncertainty. And this is also true for the observer. Right, so one definition of emergence is that we have surprise, that it's not straightforward to infer some macro result or macro pattern from the assumptions that we put into the model at the micro level. Right? So this element of surprise happens in the head of the observer, of the researcher. So the researcher himself is also exposed to some kind of uncertainty. Right? And this is, from my perspective, a very interesting aspect of that literature. So I think that, and I mentioned that already, that complexity economics and behavioral economics are really ideal complements for the study of macro if you want to include micro foundations. So again, you don't have to do that, but if you want to include micro foundations, then this might be an appropriate way to do it. So, and why? Well, we know that substantive rationality, as Herbert Simon calls it, is impossible in a complex environment. If we have an ever-changing environment with adaptive agents who change their behavior, who may not be consistent in their choices, then it's very difficult to come to apply or to show substantive rationality. So everybody is confronted with fundamental uncertainty, and some component of this is behavioral uncertainty about the behavior of the other agents. And what we need in such a kind of environment is, of course, procedural rationality, right? So, of course, people are not stupid and people are not irrational, but the best thing that we can hope for is some kind of procedural rationality, again, in the sense of Herbert Simon. Some agents, and of course it may be very rational and may be a very good idea, for example, to rely on heuristics or animal spirits, for example. And here Keynes comes in, right? So if we have to make a decision under fundamental uncertainty, well, then it may not be a bad idea to rely on animal spirits. And the group of Gerd Gigerenzer, for example, is famous for their research on heuristics, and they talk about ecological rationality, right? So you use heuristics which fit well to a certain environment, that produce good results in a certain environment. So there is some kind of evolutionary process that endows people with heuristics that work, not all the time, but in a certain environment, right? So this might also be a quite rational thing to do that. And there is learning or adaptation. So if the environment changes, well, then the old heuristics may be wrong, and then maybe new heuristics may develop. So why do I think that the two go nicely together? Well, I think that behavioral economics tells us how to model the agents. So we can learn a lot from this kind of research, how we have to model the agents. What can we learn from complexity economics? Well, complexity economics tells us how to analyze the different levels, right? And I've mentioned, so far I've mentioned just two, the micro and the macro level, but there might also be some levels in between. There might be meso levels, for example, levels of some collectives of agents, for example. And again, these might be very different, and we may have to look very differently at the different levels, and this is some message from complexity economics, and I think this is really very useful here in that context. So talking about the tool, I said, or I think that agent-based modeling might be appropriate. The research program that I've sketched here is difficult to implement or difficult to do with mathematical models or modeling. I'm not saying that it's impossible, and of course, if we can do it, we should do so, right? So there might be good uses and there might be good ideas, but not always. And sometimes we just get to some limits, and then we need a different tool, and then we could use agent-based simulation models, computer models, as a somewhat natural tool. And what I find very attractive here is that this algorithmic approach that we have here is very close to behavioral problem solving, right? So in a sense, the agents in the model behave like real decision makers, or can do so. And this is interesting. So because if you want to build such a model, if you want to set up such a model as a programmer or as a researcher, you have to put yourself into the shoes of your agents. So you have to imagine how the agents in that environment might behave, right? So what kind of information do they have? How do they get their information? How do they interact with others? With whom do they interact, right? So, and I think this is quite attractive. Agent-based models have a huge flexibility. So you can do many, many things. You can, in principle, there is no limit. You can do almost everything. It's just a programming problem. And you have many degrees of freedoms. And this is both a boon and a bane, right? So, of course, flexibility is a good thing. And it gives you, it opens new paths. So you're not constrained by the methodology, which is, of course, a big problem if you want to apply mathematics. But it's also a problem because agent-based modeling is often criticized for some arbitrary assumptions, right? So you can assume everything. And of course, if you have many degrees of freedom, then you can, of course, also explain a lot. Whether you really explain it is another question, but you can fit any kind of pattern if you have enough degrees of freedom. So this is a valid criticism against those models. And I believe that, and I'm not alone, I believe that behavioral economics can really help us to justify some assumptions about the agents. So if we model a certain behavior, we can turn to behavioral economics and can always say, okay, a certain behavior is observed in certain contexts. So we have evidence from experiments, for example, or we have evidence from surveys or field studies, and we know that people apparently behave in a certain way, and this is a justification to put it into a model, right? So this might help us to pin down some assumptions, and then they are not arbitrary anymore. So there are some schools or groups doing agent-based macroeconomics. So a group here at Bielefeld, Herbert David and his co-authors, Juris at UNIB. There is also an Italian group, so this was a joint European project. So this is a big macroeconomic model which was supposed to represent the European macro economy with an agent-based model. There are some other Italian groups, a group by Dossi, a group by Delegati and Gallegati and others, the Keynes-Schumpeter model, financial accelerator model. There are other models which combine agent-based modeling with stock flow consistent approaches. So there is a lot of work currently happening in that domain, right? So this is something that is really productive at the moment. So if we do this, if we think about behavioral and complexity macro, what does it mean? What are the implications of this? I think that there are many challenges. So these models are richer and more difficult than conventional DSGE models, and maybe also than some conventional post-Keynesian models or heterodox models, right? So it may be very difficult to pin down a clear answer to a question. So there many things can happen, right? So there is a lot of Well, there is a lot of context dependency, for example. One conceptual problem that we have here when we do this is, well, what is the right degree of granularity? How realistically do we have to model the agents? We have really a vast literature on all aspects of behavior. We can even turn to psychology proper, right, and look at what those people do and what they tell us about cognitive processes, about collection of information, processing of information, about memory processes, and so on, right? And all this is quite interesting, and in some respects this may be important. But is it important for macro, right? Do we need all this if we want to tackle macroeconomic questions? Maybe not, right? So maybe we don't need models which are so fine at the agent level, right? But what the right degree of granularity is difficult to answer. Another big problem or challenge is, well, how do we validate those models? Right? So how do we say this is a good model, this is a model that really has a good fit, this is realistic, this is really has external validity? This is not easy, right? So this is a methodological challenge, and there is a lot of discussion in that community how we really validate these models. I already mentioned that very often we don't get simple statements, and often it's difficult to say something about causality. If you have a lot of interaction, if you have a lot of feedback effects, in a sense everything is causing everything, then it's very hard to explain things and to say where a certain effect or phenomenon comes from, right? So very often it's not that A causes B. Maybe A causes B, but B also has some feedback on A, right? Or on some other variables. So in a sense, these things are connected. So often it's difficult to make precise statements about causality. And it's also well known that in complex systems, nonlinear dynamic systems, you often don't get clear-cut predictions. And from that, it's also difficult to derive simple policy solutions. Right? Some people may not like this and may criticize this approach for this, but these are inherent features of complexity, right? And if the real world is complex and has those features, well then these features are also there, not only there in our model world, but in reality, right? And why should we use models which produce nice and clear-cut predictions and explanations if the real world is different? Okay, but in general, I would say that complexity and behavior macroeconomics requires a more sophisticated view of what we really can do, what we can answer, what we cannot answer, and how we look at the world. But what is really important, and here I think we are quite close to other heterodox traditions, post-Keynesians and others, is that assumptions do matter, right? That it's not arbitrary what we put into our model, right? And that we need good justifications, and this ultimately should be some kind of empirical evidence. So the way forward, I would say that behavioral and complexity macro is still in its infancy, so we need much more research. And I've already mentioned some of the open questions. So for example, what is relevant for macro if we look at the behavioral literature? Are there any robust and parsimonious behavioral models that we could use in our macro frameworks? So what is the right balance between behavioral detail and at the micro level, and also transparency at the macro level if we want to understand macro dynamics? How do we validate these things? What kinds of answers can we get? What are the right questions that we can ask in such a framework? So what have we learned? So what have I learned working on these issues? So I would say macroeconomic models with perfectly rational representative agents are flawed. So individual agents are boundedly rational. They are not perfectly rational. But models with boundedly rational representative agents are also flawed. Right? So agents are heterogeneous. They may change their behavior, they interact, and all such. Right? So it's not a good solution to incorporate behavioral features into representative agent models. And if we want to have micro foundations, then we need a different approach. And my suggestion is, well, we could use behavioral and complexity macro with bounded rationality, heterogeneity, and of course, interaction of the different agents. Okay, thank you very much.